It's the question regarding the history of sales I get more than any other. How did the sales profession's reputation devolve so dramatically from what was once trusted and respected to what became unethical and slimy? I now know the answer, and in this episode, I'll take you through it.
There is nothing new in the world of sales except for the history you do not know. Welcome to the Sales History Podcast, bringing the brilliant and sometimes strange minds, methods, and ideas from the sales profession's past with applications to today. Here is your host, best-selling author of The Transparency Sale and The Transparent Sales Leader, keynote speaker, trainer, and nerd, Todd Caponi.
How did this happen? We went from this in 1911. Quote, true salesmanship is the science of service. Grasp that thought firmly and never let go. From Arthur Sheldon in his book, The Art of Selling. 2, just 16 years later in 1927, quote, the minute you are approached by a salesman, you tend to pull back in your shell and curl up like an armadillo. That one from Hiram Blauvelt, again in 1927. The sales profession as we know it today, where you are hired as an employee of a company versus being what is essentially a manufacturer's rep, provided training, given a dedicated territory, paid via a variable compensation plan that is part salary, part commission. You're managed by a sales manager. You attend your sales kickoff, which was then called a sales convention. You're given a quota. You have the opportunity to attend a trip for top performers. All of that came into being in the 1890s, mostly originating from John Patterson, founder and CEO of the NCR Corporation. The original concept of the sales profession was to stand on the shoulders of service, as a doctor or a member of clergy would at the time. The focus was to help customers better themselves and their organizations as a guide and educator. Now, during the early 1900s through World War I in 1918, the sales profession was a trusted, respected, and even admired profession. So much so that sales skills were taught in many of the top universities and even in several public high schools. It was also a period of rapid economic expansion. New methods of manufacturing led to new products and possibilities. Distribution methods and global accessibility grew, meaning we could not only produce innovative products at scale, but the addressable market was large too. The theme of the sales profession was service. Everyone from the president of the World Sales Congress, Norval Hawkins, to even the president of the United States was preaching that sales was a service profession and needed to stay focused as such. Salespeople selling the right products at the right prices to the right customers at the right time helped those customers grow and succeed. The idea was when those customers succeeded, they would buy more and they would hire more. As a result, the entire economy would grow. It was the core message President Woodrow Wilson delivered at the 1916 World Sales Congress in Detroit, Michigan, to the 3,000 attendees. As the First World War approached, the economy essentially shut down to focus on the national war effort. It sent many salespeople off to fight, but also pent up consumer demand. Following the war's end in November of 1918, 1919 and early 1920 were boom times here in the United States. Selling was relatively easy. The demand for salespeople exceeded the supply, meaning many salespeople changed jobs like they did during the Great Resignation times of 2021. Selling was easy. It was low pressure. Just like mid-2022 into 2023, the economy took a turn for the worse in 1921 and 1922. The forgotten depression had taken hold. and selling had gotten very difficult. Mass layoffs, with sales organizations, quote, practically purging their entire sales forces. However, through rough selling times triggered the demise of the reputation of selling. Service as a model for the sales profession thrived in the 1910s, partially because the demand for goods, for the most part, aligned to the supply. During periods of steady growth, when the right solutions are sold to the right clients at the right time, the salesperson can rightly provide a service. For the companies where their product does not fit a need, they would go out of business, either voluntarily or economic necessity would force them out. However, World War I set the United States economy on a roller coaster ride from 1918 through the 1920s. Up years, followed by down years. Wild swings. These swings eventually culminated into the Great Depression, which took hold in 1929. Again, the war stopped the economy in 1918. Coming out of the war in 1919, that pent-up demand, coupled with increased production capacity, meant a boom economy. However, as 1920 arrived and pent-up demand was met, suddenly manufacturers produced more than the market could conceivably consume. 1921 and 1922 consisted of what is known as the Forgotten Depression. It drove many organizations to purge the bulk of their sales organizations. Salesperson turnover was as high as 77% in 1921 and rose to 85% in 1922. Overproduction created desperation. Desperation created high-pressure selling. High-pressure selling crushed the reputation of the sales profession. In my research, the term high-pressure selling doesn't even appear or exist before the 1920s. Quote, by high-pressure selling, we mean those types of unscrupulous and predacious selling which are carried on by methods of coercion or deception, which do not allow deliberate choice on the part of buyers. That's a quote from William Lloyd Davis in his 1922 book, Dynamic Aspects of the Arts of Selling. A roller coaster of a decade like the 1920s essentially meant boom years like 1920, 1923, or 1926 made selling easy. But that pendulum ride down was just as bad, as each of those boom years was followed by rough years in 1921, 1924, and 1927. As a result, many sales organizations swore by their high-pressure methods. What did high-pressure selling mean? Well, William Lloyd Davis went on with this deeper explanation. Quote, it is once-over selling. Customers are not expected to buy a second time. No business is being built up. Personal friendship is not an important consideration. One call is made on a man. He must decide at once. Salesmen take the responsibility of all misrepresentation, as the printed literature disclaims all liability for the statements of the salesman. It is only a special favor to the buyer that he has been favored with a call. He must decide now or never. The opportunity will not last. The telephone and telegraph are used. The matter is so urgent. The buyer knows he is taking a chance, but his curiosity and gambling spirit have been aroused. The proposition looks too good to pass by entirely, and he will take the chance. His reason is temporarily asleep. He draws his check or signs a note. He scarcely knows how or why. He has acted under the spell of the artful, high-pressure salesman. Now, in a March of 1927 article in Hardware World magazine, S.H. Skinner wrote, quote, high-pressure selling methods have developed very rapidly in the past 4 years, largely caused by an overproduction on the part of the manufacturer. He added, high-pressure salesmen are sent out in the territory. They come uninvited and start the house-to-house campaign. They sell fast and try to get the hardware dealer to become their agent, telling him that certain territory will be assigned and that he will be the local distributor for that particular line. So essentially, pressure. Decide fast or miss out. Individuals and businesses were sold beyond their need. While that was bad, one additional dimension made it even worse: consumer debt. The 1920s represented a massive rise in consumer debt. While credit cards wouldn't arrive until the 1950s, the ability for a customer to secure debt through a banknote was on the rise. Customers were encouraged to buy now beyond their means. Quote, "The installment plan is the natural recourse of those who wish to sell and those who wish to buy desirable articles of reasonable durability, having a unit value so high that cash payment cannot easily be made." That was according to C.C. Hanch in his article, "The Scope and Effect of Installment Selling," and that was found in Advertising and Selling magazine, July 25th of 1928. Now, I mentioned S.H. Skinner in Hardware World from March of 1927 earlier. He had another quote here too, saying, "When a conditional sale is properly made, it becomes good bankable paper. The banks will use it as readily as they would a merchant's or farmer's note." In other words, installment selling and raising of consumer debt was celebrated at the time. Hanch, that general manager of the National Association of Finance Companies, who clearly had a bias here when he wrote, quote, "Perhaps the most important effect of installment selling has been the practical obliteration of economic barriers between the rich and those in moderate circumstances. The feeling is that the rich man has not got much on the poor man. The beneficial effect of this is in discouraging socialistic tendencies is incalculable." In other words, everyone can have everything until they have to pay for it, until the banks run out of cash, until fear takes over. There was an article that I was researching on the stock market crash of 1929. I found it at study.com, and they wrote, quote, "While other factors contributed, the rise in household debt was a significant factor in the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression." In other words, salespeople and high-pressure selling techniques played a, quote, "significant role in the longest depression in our economy's history." As Gifford K. Simons wrote in the American Way to Prosperity book in 1928, 1 year before the beginning of that Great Depression, quote, "High-pressure selling, it seems, raises the peaks of boom and depresses the valleys of depression of the business cycle." Gosh, it's like he was a Nostradamus at the time, right? If that isn't enough to erode a reputation, I don't know what is. Throughout the 1920s, well-known sales leaders took to the periodicals to debate low-pressure versus high-pressure selling. In an edition of Sales Management magazine from 1927, the aforementioned Hiram Blauvelt wrote an article titled, "High-Pressure Selling is the Bunk." He wrote, quote, "Most of us are getting sick of high-pressure selling. We have heard it preached, published, and practiced to death. New sales managers and new salesmen start off like a steam boiler under high pressure and either blow off ineffectively or blow up altogether. It seems strange that this type of selling has come into such great vogue, as it is more apt to lose orders." But pages later in that same edition, a guy named Tom Hanlon wrote his own article, ripping Blauvelt's take. He titled it, quote, "Low-pressure selling is nothing but order taking." Hanlon starts in with this rant, quote, "If Mr. Blauvelt has any children, he probably have had to engage in high-pressure selling, no matter how much he dislikes it. For those children of his will someday have to be high-pressured into going to school. There will come times where they would much prefer to go fishing, swimming, or riding, when they would much prefer to stay out at the summer home or at the beach than to come in and go to school. But because he is a good father, he will use all manner of so-called high-pressure methods to induce them to go." He continued, quote, "It would be a wonderful thing if every prospect appreciated at first glance the value of the various articles offered him by salesmen. But human beings are not built that way. All of us have to be convinced. And often, the better a thing is for us, the more strenuous convincing is necessary. So while Woodrow Wilson, Arthur Sheldon, Norval Hawkins, and all the great sales philosophers from the first 20 years of the 1900s proclaimed that service to the customer raises all ships, high-pressure sales philosophers felt that it was high-pressure selling that raised all ships. Paul Fasnacht, a VP for a company called Rudolph Moss Inc., wrote in the July 25th, 1928 edition of Advertising and Selling magazine, quote, "When a manufacturer is producing something people need and want and is still unable to secure outlet for his efficient production volume, he should not blame his predicament on limited national income. Clever selling ideas, well-planned advertising, good merchandising, and easy purchasing terms not only stimulate buying, but also increase the ability of consumers to buy. By forcing more merchandise to be sold, by high-pressure selling and advertising, more people are kept working. The salesman, the advertising man, the manufacturer, the financier, the workers in the factory. Each in turn earns a profit or wage and so increases ability to consume. The growth of their buying power makes them purchasers in other industries, and thus an entire chain for the benefit of every industry operates." He added, quote, "Henry Ford long ago realized that the high wages and prosperity of his employees, which were made possible by huge volume and sale of that volume, stimulated all industry, generally made possible for more and more people to afford automobiles. Statisticians 15 years ago stated confidently that the saturation point for automobiles in the United States would be reached at the 5 million mark. Today, there are more than 20 million automobiles in the United States, and the end is not in sight." Again, that was 1928. While the sales profession was being taught in many universities and high schools into the 1920s, that was all gone by the late 1920s. The sales profession wasn't one individuals grew up pursuing any longer. Irreparably damaged, and we're still suffering the consequences. High pressure presided through the Great Depression years of 1929 to 1939. Salespeople couldn't help but be desperate when the sale meant keeping a roof over their head and their families fed. Departing the Great Depression, we soon after entered World War II, which took us all the way out to 1946. So imagine that, a period from 1921 to 1946, so 25 years, where the foundations of our profession built on a bed of service had been completely generationed out. How would we rebuild that reputation when nobody who practiced the old way was still around? Well, the good news is, beginning in 1947, articles began to pop up, like a series in Sales Management magazine from May of 1947. Those were titled, quote, "Low Pressure Selling, Is It a Forgotten Art?" And it had a subtitle of, quote, "Are we placing too much emphasis on selling and not enough on techniques which exploit the average prospect's natural desire to buy?" In this article, the author shared a study that was done on approaches, where a group of approximately 30 retail stores were called on, half employing high-pressure techniques, the other half low-pressure. For the high-pressure 15, those were approached where orders were solicited from the very start. Out of those 15, 5 stores were sold on the first call, but several of those failed to repeat. Only 4 of the 15 became regular customers. With the other 15, no attempt was made to sell the first time. The first call was only a pleasant introductory call, explaining why the company was expanding, what it had to offer, and that the salesman would call again the next week. The call was then followed by a letter from the home office, thanking them for his courtesy to the salesperson, and including a couple of sentences about the company and its approach. Then, the second time the salesperson called, he asked for the order. 10 out of the 15 placed an order, and all 10 became regular customers. So again, that was 1947. You see that the difference between low pressure and high pressure meant more customers and more long-term customers. Into the 1950s, there were books and magazine articles focused on the subject. One such article was written by Edward C. Bursk in 1959. He was the managing editor of Harvard Business Review from 1946 to 1972. In it, Bursk focused on the challenges and requirements of bringing back low-pressure selling. He said, quote, "All low-pressure selling runs the danger of being ineffectual unless the absence of high pressure is compensated for by positive effort. More is required of salesmen using this technique than merely being pleasant." In other words, so much of the low-pressure approach is staked on not arousing resistance. He added that high pressure, by definition, is more focused on emotional appeals and exaggerated claims. He said, quote, "It is relatively easy to teach high-pressure selling because the essence of that technique is that the prospect submits to something imposed on him from without. It is possible to standardize the sales presentation, to formulate it in the home office and show the salesman how to do it. The opposite is the case with any approach involving low-pressure selling." Burks believed this, quote, "Above all, a more intelligent type is needed. A normal man will not find it unnatural or difficult to assume the habit of thinking in terms of his customers' problems, but he will have to do a greater amount of more subtle thinking, adapting to individual cases and swinging sales on finer points. Certainly he cannot operate by rote and ritual." Now, I actually secured a copy of another Edward Berman, in his 1957 book, Successful Low-Pressure Salesmanship. The subtitle is, quote, "The Gentle Art of Making Yourself Easy to Buy From." One of the reviews, which came from the Indianapolis News of the book, struck me as almost comical. Quote, "His gentle words warm the cockles of a mild man's heart. It is to be hoped that his urgings of honesty, quiet talk, courteous and informative pitches do more to thin the ranks of the remaining high-pressurers." As defined by Berman, quote, "Low-pressure selling is the quiet, courteous, and friendly science of using convincing reasons why a customer should buy a product or service from you instead of somebody else. I believe we all agree that low-pressure selling is making a comeback." Berman in the book tells a story. He says, quote, "The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story about the boss who fired his top saleswoman. When sales sagged sharply last fall, the owner came up with an unusual countermeasure. He fired his top-selling clerk. He said, quote, 'She was my only high-pressure saleswoman, and I don't believe in high pressure,' he said. 'Sales have increased every month since she left.'" In April of 1925, going back there, Jacob Billow, in a book called Survey Graphic, said this, and I thought it was pretty powerful. He said, "Did you ever think of the strain to which people with small incomes are subjected by our continual pursuit of them to spend their money? Every human impulse, good and bad, is played upon. We set about deliberately to make a person feel that life would be a failure unless he or she uses this soap or shaving cream, drives this automobile, owns this radio, sees this movie or play, eats this food, wears this collar, takes this trip, or reads this newspaper. This continuous pressure, relentlessly applied, subjects our working class population to a strain which they cannot withstand, nor could we in their places. Periods of steady growth are what seems to bring back the value of the low-pressure approaches, where honesty, integrity, and long-term plays win the longevity of a business, while also winning the day at hand. However, we've seen a continued devolution into high-pressure tactics every time pressure on short-term survival increases. The impact of our shut-off economy in the spring of 2020 due to COVID sent the pendulum back swinging, much like it did during World War I, in a positive direction in late 2020 through early 2022, then back negative throughout the rest of 22 through 2023. Talk of high pressure sprung forth once again as desperate times called for desperate measure. Are we headed back into a period where lower pressure wins the day? I'm biased, but I sure hope so. And as you know, I believe transparency sells better. It retains clients better. It grows better. It leads better and creates advocates better than any other approach, regardless of the economy. The long game wins the long game, but due to the proliferation of reviews, feedback, and accessibility to the truth, with everything we do, buy, and experience, I believe we have to embrace transparency either way. And that essentially is a form of what I would call low-pressure selling. What do you think? The answer to the question is, when did the reputation of the sales profession erode from being trusted and respected to being at the bottom of Gallup's annual ethical professions list along with politicians today? Well, it was clear during the modern upbringing of the sales profession in the early 1900s. That first forgotten depression of the early 1920s created desperation. It created these high-pressure tactics where essentially the viewpoint was that the customer doesn't know what's right for them, doesn't know what's best for them, so we should pound them until they buy. That was the beginning of the end. And again, that was the 1920s, and here we are 100 years later, still struggling with that reputation. I think there's a chance to get it back, and I would love to hear your thoughts. As always, if you like this, please share it, please review it, please tell your friends about it. I do this again as a hobby. I do post daily at Sales Historian on both Instagram and Twitter if you're looking for little quotes, little clips from articles, comics, pictures, all kinds of stuff from the beginnings of our profession. And as always, I so appreciate you investing your time in this and hope you got some value from it. All right? Until next time, thanks again.